Hey folks, it's Nate. It's time I got back to the drawing board, and tonight we are back with Chapter 7 of Naoki Urosawa's Monster. This is where things really start to heat up. And they heat up because of this guy here. Well, to an extent. Yeah, Inspector Lunge has come to interrogate Herr Junkers and find out what he knows about the murders that Lunge has been investigating. And as you can see, this doesn't really go too well. Inspector Lunge is asking some very relevant questions to the investigation. He offers Junkers a plea bargain if he will roll over on the people who he helped commit the murders, and all this really gets him is a very disturbing reaction from Junkers. So Tenma chases Lunge out of the room on Doctor's orders, and he kind of takes matters into his own hands to a certain extent. A few pages later, we see Tenma taking Junkers out to get some fresh air, and he talks with him a little bit. He shares with Junkers the story of his operating on Johann to save his life and how that revitalized him as a doctor, helped him overcome his fear of death that he was always confronting every day as a doctor. And that is what really gets through to Junkers, and Junkers tells him an interesting story about his first crime and how he just broke into a store really to steal a clock. That's all he really wanted, but that kind of sealed his fate as it was. And you know, he had a rough life. It doesn't excuse what he did, but it's clear how he became who he is. And Tenma tells him to come clean, tell the police everything, you know, start over. But you know, he's prodding Junkers to do the right thing, but that just results in Junkers panicking. Now, eventually, Tenma goes out and he has dinner with a date that his friend Dr. Beckner set him up on, and eventually he comes across a cuckoo clock, much like Herr Junkers mentioned, and he heads back. And that's kind of where things go south, because Inspector Lunge put a guard over Junkers, because as he pointed out to Tenma, lots of strange things happen to the people around Dr. Tenma, and he didn't want anything strange happening to Junkers. Well, Junkers eventually decides to talk to Dr. Tenma again. And when he does, he goes out and he finds something that makes him quite startled. And here again, in this last panel, we see Urosawa's command of a face and expression, and using them to build tension. Unlike the full page in Chapter 5, where Tenma was answering the door, this is a expression to build tension. We see Junkers' shock and horror in something he sees, but we don't know what it is. And it's placed here at the end of a page so that we have to turn the page to find out what happened. That's a great way to keep a reader going through your story. This is one of the techniques that Urosawa really seems to have mastered. He uses it almost constantly in his work. There's probably about 2 pages or panels like this in every volume of one of his stories from this point on, and probably before. I don't think that Monster was the first suspense story that Urosawa wrote. If you're familiar with his body of work, Urosawa has written all kinds of stories. He wrote a sports manga called Yawara, which is about a girl who practices judo and maybe kind of sort of doesn't quite really fall in love. There's Master Keaton, which is about an insurance adjuster, and it's a lot more interesting than that sounds, believe me. He didn't come to suspense until later in his career, but he really mastered it, and this is one of the techniques he developed that really helps him sell that sense of tension, that sense that something is about to happen. And it's really interesting because in this particular case, you turn the page, you don't immediately find out what happens. We cut back to Tenma. He's bought this clock. He's bringing it to the hospital. And it isn't until the next page after that that we see what it was Junker saw. And we see this officer collapsed here by the door. And as Tenma runs up and gets closer, we see he's drooling, and there's something leaking from his nose. And Tenma discovers he's dead. There's a candy wrapper next to him. And of course, the murders that put Tenma where he is, the murders for which Inspector Lunge justifiably still suspects him, were all committed with poison candy. That is, in fact, a thing that Inspector Lunge reminded Tenma of when they met again in this chapter. And so this is something that's fresh on Tenma's mind, and as soon as he sees this, he knows something is wrong. So he bursts into the hospital room. Of course, there's no one there, but he looks out and he sees that Herr Junkers is running away across the hospital yard. He chases him down the fire escape, and eventually they get to a parking garage here in that's here in the hospital. At least I presume that's where this is. And it's at this point that we finally get an answer to some of the questions we have, because this whole time something sinister has been dogging Tenma. There are the murders, of course. There was the family, the Lieberts, who defected from Eastern Germany 10 years ago, or 9 years ago, really. There's, of course, been the murders of his director, the hospital director, and the head of surgery, who were admittedly hostile to him, but who were nonetheless murdered under very suspicious circumstances. And there's been, this murder of middle-aged couples all over Germany that Lunge himself is inspecting. And we are about to see what is at the heart of all of those murders. And it's a monster by the name of Johann Liebert. And this is the point where Tenma has to confront his notions of responsibility. Because he saved Johann's life 9 years ago. And now Johann is carving a bloody swath through all of Germany. And I remind you that the Japanese notion of responsibility puts those deaths not just at Johann's feet, but at Tenma's. Because Dr. Tenma chose to save Johann's life. So he is responsible for that life until the end. This is a very foreign concept to many Americans and people who have grown up in the Western area. Again, you are partly responsible for the actions of your children. And in many ways, by saving Johann's life, Dr. Tenma became a sort of surrogate parent to him in the eyes of, Japanese ethics. He is now responsible for the creation of a monster. And it is that conundrum, it is that challenge to Dr. Tenma's ethics that will drive him through the rest of the story. And that's why it was so important that we see everything that happened in the first 5 chapters to now. Because the greatest monsters that you face are those that you create yourself. I'll see you in chapter 8.